Thank you for coming. If I haven't had a chance to greet you personally, and if we haven't met personally yet, I'm Mariann. I'm your bishop. And I've been a bishop for this much amount of time relative to my vocation in the ministry, where I was a parish priest for 23 years. And so I'm thrilled to be able to talk about something that I actually have some experience in. And also to do so with one of my best friends in the world and an extraordinary conversation partner in mission and ministry, Dr. Lisa Kimball, who will be our keynote speaker and companion throughout the weekend. And I suppose many of you already know Lisa through her ministry here in the Diocese at Epiphany Church and also at Virginia Seminary. If you haven't met her yet, you're also in for a treat. Thanks for being here.
I just want to remind you all that she was a baptized Christian before she was a priest.
There you go.
We can learn some things as lay people too, you know.
Touché. That's why Lisa's up here, to keep us all honest. And of course she's right, that the ministry we share as baptized Christians is fundamental and foundational to everything. And our work in congregations is in service and in response to the need that we all have as Christians to gather as Jesus gathered his disciples into community for all the things that we can be in community that we can't be alone. A friend of ours used to say that, you know, if being a Christian was just a matter of being spiritual by ourselves, we could all sit together, we'd all sit in our rooms with a candle and say our prayers and go about our faith journeys. But that's not what we're called to. We're called to a life of deep personal faith, but also faith in community, for all the things that community can give us and teach us and stretch us, and also the things that are possible when we move in community that are simply impossible when we act alone. The topic for today is growing a congregation in theory and in practice. And it comes from a sort of a running conversation that I've had at different meetings around the diocese when people would say, would you talk more about something that I mentioned relative to my work as a rector in St. John's, Minneapolis? And I thought, well, wouldn't that be fun to just spend some time reflecting back on the things that I learned over the years of parish ministry? And so I thank you for being a conversation partner with all of us in that. And so I'm going to present some ideas. Lisa's going to chime in from time to time. Try to finish up in a timely enough way so that there's some time for questions. If you have a really burning question that you want to raise as I'm talking, feel free to raise your hand, and we will start that process right away. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we are gathered as your people of this tradition, of this faith, disciples on your path. And we ask your blessing upon us now on this Friday afternoon at the preamble to our convention, considering the ways that we might be faithful to you and to your Spirit revealed to us in Christ and as we experience it in community. For all these people gathered, their hearts' concerns, I give you thanks. And we dedicate our lives, and this time in particular, to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Let me just say a few things by way of introduction. As you know, as I've said before, I was a parish priest for 23 years before I was blessed to be elected as your bishop. And I believe I interpret my election as your bishop in large measure because of my background and my passion for congregational ministry. That when we spoke of those things together in the discernment process, there was a real sense of connection that I felt, and that the election seemed to validate that God was calling this diocese to a time of renewal and focus and rebuilding of congregations and core ministries. And so a person like me would be someone that would be an amazingly likely candidate, to my amazement, I should say, that you would discern that for me, and for which I am profoundly grateful. So I want to say a little bit about how I came to be so passionate about congregational life, which was a revelation to me as it was happening. I did not imagine myself, when I started the ordination process in my early 20s, I did not imagine that I would become so grounded and so in love with our congregational expression of ministry. I imagined myself living far more on the margins and doing work that would call the church into the world in a more justice and multicultural, actually international ministry. And so as I lived my life in congregational life, it was as much a transformation of me as it was the evolving of my vocation. And what I came to realize, as we've talked about before, that the Episcopal Church is a jewel on the spectrum of Christianity, with all of the gifts that we ourselves enjoy and that we at this time in our lives can offer to the world. And that those gifts are manifest and lived out every day in our Christian congregations. And that so at this juncture in our life, when it's so critical that we reflect on what it means to be Christian community and how we build our communities, and perhaps most pointedly, how we equip them to share what we have in a culture that so desperately needs it, and a time in our lives when those muscles of our communal life are a bit out of shape. We are not as equipped and as adept as we could be as congregations to live the full capacity of our mission and vocation in the world. And so it was, and my sense of that and my observing and my growing in that edge as I was going through my ministry is what I'd like to talk about today. So that's, if that wasn't what you were expecting, I feel like, the stewardess on the plane, this is the trip to congregational development. That's what we're going to be talking about. So, first stop in my ordained life was as the associate rector of a church in Toledo, Ohio. Brand new priest, wanted to learn the craft. I was hired by a brilliant rector who knew me from my sponsoring diocese and who very graciously hired me when I was 9 months pregnant with our first child. And so I owe him more than I can say. I was petrified about parenting, didn't know a thing about ministry. He saw me, he believed in me, and he called me. What I didn't know until I got to the parish, that he was also a very deeply troubled and wounded man. And his woundedness and his inability to acknowledge it and to deal with it personally began to have significant systemic effects on the congregation. And my place in relationship to him and to the congregation was the perfect triangle to absorb all of that stress and all of that pain. And I didn't understand it at all. I was just watching it. And it was crazy making to me. It was absolutely crazy making because he was brilliant. He was responsible for my access or my first path into ordained ministry. He made so much possible for me. Sometimes when he spoke, I felt it was God speaking to us. And yet, he had demons inside him that he could not and would not acknowledge, that were playing themselves out in the congregational life as we were living it. And it went on. I was there for 5 years, and it got progressively worse. And I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know where to go. And it was by the grace of God and the kindness of a friend who was a classmate from seminary, who had been steeped in the world of Rabbi Friedman and family systems, who suggested to me that I read Generation to Generation. And I picked it up and I started reading it. I didn't understand half of what I read, but when I came to a section on secrets and the effects of secrets on a family, and I read what Dr. Friedman was describing, I thought, he is describing Trinity Church. I don't know what the secrets are, but this kind of insanity is what he's describing. Now, I'm not going to linger here much longer, only to say that that was my introduction into the need to be a healthy leader to lead healthy community. That we as leaders, lay and ordained, have a tremendous responsibility to take care of our own lives and tend to our lives, and particularly to tend to those areas where we are most vulnerable, which typically has to do with relationships, unresolved relationships in our extended families. And to tend to them, not fix them, because we can't fix them, but tend to them so that when they surface, as they will in the congregation, we don't live them out there, or we don't ask other people to bear the burden of our unresolved issues, right? So I learned that, and I learned it big time. And the way I coped in those years was to keep notes to myself, what I'm not going to do when I'm a rector. This is what I'm not going to do, and I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to do that. So I had my list. I also, because I was blessed to be in a congregation that gave me a tremendous amount of freedom, and by the way, who loved me to pieces because I wasn't the rector. Classic setup for associates. I also began to sense my own desire to, what would it be like to lead a healthy community? What would it be like to be the leader as opposed to the one always having to pick up for the leader? What would it be like? And I began to sense this call to be a rector. And I was blessed by the call to go to St. John's, Minneapolis. Now, when I came to St. John's, Minneapolis, and Lisa followed me not far behind, plucky urban church, right? About 100 and so members, very pleased with itself because it had just come through a real death and resurrection experience. They almost closed. They had an invigorating new rector who helped them, along with some very vigorous lay readers, basically go from the place of, almost having to shut down to being a community. And they were a justice church, and they loved that, and I loved them, and they loved me, and we got off to a marvelous start, And I take preaching very seriously. I'm a pretty good preacher. They loved my preaching. And so I would get accolades upon accolades about my preaching. And I was thinking, and so I'm being a non-anxious presence. I'm being clear with my boundaries. I'm preaching well. We should be able to grow this church. And we weren't. We weren't growing. We were healthy, kind of plucky. They really loved who they were. I loved them. And we weren't growing. And first of all, I began to realize, okay, you're not going to leapfrog into glory here. This is actually hard work. It's hard work. And there's some things here that are blocking our growth. And I have to figure out what they are. I have to understand what is it that's getting in our way. What's keeping this congregation from growing? And how can I understand what this is about? The one theory, the reason I titled this Theory and Practice is because being immersed in Friedman theory taught me the value of theory, right? Taught me the value of learning things to apply and to engage in congregation. So I started looking around for other theories, other conversation partners, other ways that I might learn. And I stumbled across the one predominant lens through which Episcopal churches tend to define themselves by size, and that's Arlen Rutledge's Family Pastoral Program Resource, right? And you all know the categories because we all know where we fit, right? And so St. John's, to use his typology, was right comfortably in that family size or pastoral sized church with a priest that they loved, and every once in a while getting right to the edge of program and then retreating right back, right? And we went through that pattern, and we talked about it, and all that was things that we needed to be to become a program church. And I started, and it began to dawn on me that while that was a very descriptive way to understand the churches, that methodology was not helping us to grow. And in fact, the literature all said that the move from pastoral to program was the hardest transition of all, and most churches don't make it. Thanks. And I think actually if you stay in that typology, he's right. It's actually true. And so, helpful but not. The only thing that you could do, and again, I'm being overly simple here, so please forgive me if I'm stepping on theorists that you respect, but the only way you could fix this is to hire more clergy, right? You hire more clergy. or more professional staff, but with an emphasis on clergy, because you basically need to keep on growing and moving to the point where you have about one staff person for about every 50 to 100 people. That's kind of the model. Then our diocese brought in someone to do congregational development work. His name was Mark Clevenger. And one day he led a conference on congregational development. And he put this is going to be hard for some of you to see, but I'll walk you through it. He basically put on the bulletin, on the board, this series of concentric circles. And in so doing, introduced me and the clergy of that diocese to the theories of Rick Warren and the purpose-driven church. You're nodding your head, some of you, you've read it. Totally opened my eyes. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there were a few key concepts that could be so helpful in helping to transform and grow a congregation. And I'm going to talk about several of them, but I'm going to start with the circles because it was my point of entry. This circle, and for those of you at Redeemer, forgive me because we just did this at, wasn't it Redeemer where we did this? I can't remember, somewhere. I thank you. This circle represents your church community. Everything inside this circle are the boundaries of your church community, however you experience and define that. And including your physical space and your sanctuary and your worship experience, your community experience. And if there were a door, imagine a door that is the point of entry for everyone else who is outside of your faith community, right? You might have several points of entry. Your worship may be one. You may have a Sunday school, a small group ministry. The point is, people come in from the outside to your faith community. And his theory was that if people are doing that, Jesus is moving in their lives in a significant way and moving them toward a place where they might be drawn. They're drawn to Christian community for something. And that represents a spiritual movement in that person or family's life. And he said, what do you think they're looking for as they're walking in the door? I'll give you a hint. They're not looking for a pledge card. They're not looking for the reports of all of our committees, the things we tend to think new people walking through the door might be interested in. They're not looking at our leadership structure right now, unless they happen to be coming from an active church engagement in another part of the country. You know, if you were active in another, then you want all that stuff because you've already cut. But I'm talking about somebody who's moving into church community, having been away for a long period of time or never having been rooted. And typically, in the beginning, he said, what they're searching for is meaning for themselves and for their own lives. And they're looking to us to provide them a space where God will speak to them, right? And move them in some way. They're not even looking to engage us very much because what they want is something that they can take from that experience and go back to their lives with. We all want that, actually, even those of us who are the most engaged. We all need that. And if our churches aren't providing that for us, then our churches are anemic in some very significant ways. So one of the things that we have to think about as church developers is, are people, when they walk in the door, being fed? Are we giving our people, whoever walks in the door, something to feed them, to take away from our communal worship, our communal life, to guide them through their lives? Some of these people, after a while, and oh, by the way, he said for a healthy congregation, what's your guess of the percentage of a worshiping Sunday morning community that he would recommend as a healthy percentage of a Sunday morning congregation? In the outer circle. People that we don't know that are coming looking for us for meaning. 20%. 20%. Now think about that relative to the majority of Episcopal congregations. Now, a cathedral, absolutely. A large church, absolutely. One of the things, but most of our congregations are small. St. John's, Minneapolis was small. So we had become unaccustomed to being a place where people could come for public worship, a place to experience the grace of God and not be swooped over by the community wanting them to be, for us. We want to be welcoming, right? We want to be hospitable. But sometimes we kind of work in opposition to the presenting spiritual hunger that people have, because we haven't learned how to relax and let people worship with us freely, without price. Some of those people, and a small percentage of those people will then, after worshiping with us for a time, and not every Sunday. How many of you are in church every Sunday now? I mean, life is changing, right? Yes, yeah. But am I right? Worship patterns are changing, lives are changing, right? So some of those people will begin to notice that the people around them, all of you and your peers and friends, have something really great going on. There's a lot of love between you. There's a lot of goodness. And they kind of want some of that. And they'd like a place, they'd like a pew that's theirs. That they could sit in and know that when they go, that's where they belong. And that people will greet them and they begin to ask those sorts of questions. How do you join this place? How do you get in? Or they just signal to the rector in some way, And that's when the search for meaning is added to it is a search and a desire for community. And Warren would say that's when you begin the new member conversations. And counterintuitive to me at the time, he said, raise the bar as high as possible. Rather than making it easier for people to become members, raise the bar, have a class, talk about spirituality, talk about what it means to be. Talk about what it means for you to be a member. You lay peoples, peers of these people. What it means for you to be part of this community. What it costs you and what you receive. What it will cost them and what they can expect to receive. And then, for those who feel and what surprised me as I gathered up the courage to encourage St. John's to do this, what surprised us all is that as we raised the bar, people expressed gratitude. Because the bar's high anyway, we just don't tell people, right? Right? Am I right? We just don't tell people. And so then when we start sort of raising, we do pledge. Yeah, actually, we do ask people to serve. Yeah, actually, being a disciple of Jesus is not easy. Rather than surprising people with that and then getting a little ticked when they don't respond, be clear up front as you're telling them. And you know what? We wouldn't trade this for the world because this is the kingdom of God. We've been given the keys of eternal life, and we would not trade this for the world. And we welcome you. Not only do we welcome you, we need you. We cannot be the people of God we're called to be without you and your gifts. What are your gifts? And how would you like to express them in this congregation? Long, fruitful conversations focused on them and ministry and our community, because this is another conversion point, according to Warren. They're going deeper in their life of faith as it's lived in Christian community. Some of those people will feel a call, as you have, to leadership. They'll look around as you have and said, or they'll be asked as you were, to help out, to offer their gifts in a particular way. They could see something and they offer to make it better. They feel called to leaders. Now, one of the mistakes that small churches make often is we ask these people to assume the leadership and maturity of those who are in fact the leaders of the community. In our effort to be welcoming, I can't tell you how many times people would say to me, I think we should ask so-and-so to join the vestry. I'd like to get him more involved. And I would be thinking, I think involvement would be great, but maybe not the vestry, right? The core, primary spiritual and fiduciary leaders of the community deserve to be people who have been tested and tried, and for people who know what they're getting into, right? Just as but now, and then he said, and the treasure of it all, this mystical thing called discipleship, that we all aspire to, that none of us fully attain, that union with Christ love of self, love of neighbor, love for the world that not only carries the heart of the congregation with them wherever they go, but also is in intentional and devout ministry as ambassadors of Christ in the world. So that gave me 10 years worth of parish development work, just talking about that and thinking about that with the leaders of the community. We were just beginning to have a public presence, and it wasn't comfortable. People would say, I come to church and I don't know people anymore. And that was not said in a positive way. I come to church and there are people that I don't know who are sitting where I used to sit. And so we had to learn what it meant to be public in our worship, to allow people in and to celebrate their presence without judgment or without assumption, to be comfortable. Now, there are some real benefits to being a public place of worship. One of the first ones is your loose plate goes way up. And I'm not, the first year that happened, the vestry's like, oh, this public church. I mean, I remember when the warden was interpreting it to the vestry. Well, now that we're a public church, and I'm thinking, yes, Jesus. So that's one, but it takes practice. We were also very deficient in the places where people could experience community, small groups, Bible studies, faith formation, informal gatherings, not at church, but in people's homes. And that wasn't just affecting outsiders. It was depriving our own members the possibility, and also even the expectation that if you are a Christian, you are in constant formation in terms of your understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we just didn't have any of that. We had almost none. And so no wonder we weren't growing. We didn't have places for people to land. And those who had their 20 or so friends in the church, they really weren't interested in having 20 more friends. They had their friends, right? They had their community. So we had to create other places where community could form so that the experience of community would grow without asking the people who were doing everything already anyway to assume 10 new best friends in the church, right? What they had to let go of was their idea that they would know and love everybody in the church. Because once you begin to grow, one of the things you have to let go of is knowing everybody. And also you have to let go of your priest being able to pastor everyone one-on-one. And that will get me to I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to fast forward to one thing about that, and then actually I'm going to let Lisa speak in just a moment, but the one thing I wanted to say about the shifting functioning of clergy, the other thing that I realized in this process was that if this church was going to grow, I had to change the way I was functioning. I had to change. I had to change the way I engaged in ministry in the congregation. And the two ways I had to change the most were in how we did faith formation and how we did pastoral care. And that pastoral care needed to be a collective responsibility of the community, lived out in small group relationships and in equipped lay pastoral ministers that could take the ministry, not that I would step out of it, but that it would be a team effort, and that when we taught classes, we had to multiply the effect of our classes so that it wasn't just one class taught by the rector, but it might be 10 groups leading a discussion on a given topic, or 10 different groups doing 10 different things, or having multiple opportunities to do the same thing because people's schedules. Do you hear what I'm saying? Getting me out of the center and spreading the ministry around among the baptized. Did you want to say something about the...
What's our time like? Because you're in a good place.
It's 1:45, so we're going to go... What time is when do we go to? Till 2:15? 2:45? Oh, we got lots of time.
So keep going for a bit.
All right. I'm going to stop here just for questions or comments. Any thoughts about this? Just anything at all? Yeah. If you stand up and say your name for everyone.
Deputy Corbett Welch, St. Luke's, Brighton. Where was your church in a city?
Neighborhood in a city. Neighborhood in a city with a sanctuary, no parking, sanctuary that seats about 200 people, building in total disrepair, organ that died. Am I missing anything? Yeah.
Oh, ugly paint.
Oh, an ugly paint.
Ugly paint.
Ugly paint. And and a real aversion to raising money to spend money on themselves. This was a justice parish, right? So they were giving it all away. So, I mean, the idea of raising money for the building, for example. So, yeah, but your question?
My question is, how can this translate into a community that I'm in that has about Brighton consists of the church and the house across the street, and they did a study that found that 95% of the people in our area are Roman Catholic. Mm-hmm. How does a church my size in my area, who knows where Brighton is? Yeah. And that's, even in the diocese, most people don't even know where Brighton is. And so my problem is I have welcoming people, I have involved people, I have wonderful disciples, but how do I bring them in now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a radical
Lisa?
No, actually, I have an answer to you. Go first. You go first.
I guess what I would say, first of all, I'd say a couple of things. Every context deserves its own careful evaluation and study. So what would work in one situation may not work in another, right? Mm-hmm. But I would say that the majority of people who came into St. John's in the time I was there, the majority were former Roman Catholics. So I just want to say that we have a lot in common with the Catholic Church. We have a lot in common. And that there are ways, it's not fair, and I'm married to a Roman Catholic, so this is a daily conversation for us. It's never fair to compare the worst of one congregation of one denomination over against the worst of another, right? It's just not fair. Yeah, we got you on women's ordination, sorry, but the Roman Catholic Church does many other things very, very well that we can't even compete in, and one of them is community. I mean, in terms of they know how to do church in places where we don't. Often in lower income areas, in rural areas, in immigrant communities, the Roman Catholic Church has us beat hands down in a good way. So I don't know the answer to that, but I would expect that it's going to, anything that's like weaving straw into gold, you start with what you have. You start with what you have, and you work from there. Whatever that is. And so if you have a jewel of a small community, it might be as simple as finding ways to create opportunities for people to have faith conversations with their neighbors in some informal way. It might be as simple as that, or it might be as bold as trying to do something really dramatic that gets your name out there. But I don't want to imply that there's an easy path, a kind of, if you do these 5 things, your church will grow, because that's not how you know that. That's not how it works. I'm just sharing with you some of the things that I learned. And maybe what we need to do, and part of the work of this convention, is to gather people from congregations in similar experiences and begin to discern strategic planning that is more than just one congregation. Because there are enough that have things in common where if we shared resources and ideas and infused resources, we might begin to make some fire. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. Let me just add a couple. Everything the bishop just said, I think, is exactly right. I think there's also the important piece for all of us about how we define church and how we define success. So, first of all, I think we cannot grow numerically if we're not growing spiritually. And I don't know a single person in any congregation who doesn't have room to grow spiritually. So if there is a sense, that the congregation is willing to work on their own discipleship and their own personal spiritual growth, there's great success to be born there. And that brings up the level of optimism, the level of hope about why we exist at all. I think we have to think clearly about being church beyond our walls. It's not about the building. It's not just about the lovely liturgy at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. It's not even about the great education programs. It's about our witness to the world in the world. And so I think smaller churches have a gift. They know each other's stories often better than membership in larger congregations do. How can you tell stories to each other about what your ministries look like at work, or in your extended families, or in the coffee shop, or when you're mowing the lawn, or whatever it is you do in those spaces in your life where you are being your full embodied beloved of God's self. And then with that, I think it opens up possibilities for imagining new ways of being church successfully, which may include growing in numbers, that might cultivate partnerships with other churches, other denominations. It may cultivate possibilities through technology, that you discover your own stories. There are people who have aptitude with technologies. You can do things with virtual reality that actually bring other numbers and voices into your conversation. I think those of us who are blessed to be in congregations with financial resources need to think seriously about partnering with small congregations that are planted in locations where realistically the economics of that location are not going to change. How do we partner in such a way that we inspire their profound ministries that may still be small in number? And to do that, I think the small congregations have to be willing to let go of some things. There are some small congregations across our wider church that have given up their building because they realize that sustaining the building in the quality of standard they had become accustomed to was no longer mission. And that's a hard thing to say, but there are some stories where those churches are thriving. They are speaking the gospel, living the gospel in nursing homes, in schools. They are doing family studies in homes so that can't get to church. They're doing things together in ways that are so imaginative and so rich. That's the rare end of the spectrum because we love our buildings and we need places to come together in the gathering of the community and to celebrate the sacrament. So that has to be figured out. But I just think that we have to think about what do we mean by church? What do we mean by mission? And how do we celebrate success? How do we honor what God is already doing? So we build on joy and the possibilities rather than the sense of decline or the sense that it's all about numbers, because it's not. There are places where God is working well when 2 or 3 are gathered, and there are places where God is not working so well where several thousand are gathered. So, we're not letting God work well, is a better way to put that. So I think not to be defeated and find partners in places that might be your partners.
One or two more questions, and then we'll move on.
Cassandra Burton, Rector, Christ Church, Clinton, Maryland. We are right down the street from a large Roman Catholic church. What we have done, we have a spaghetti dinner once a month. We go up to the Catholic church and we put flyers on all their cars. And we have it timed so when they come out of their 5 o'clock mass, they all come down the street to the Episcopal Church.
That's great.
On Christmas Eve, we had many of those who've supported our spaghetti dinner bring members of their families who have become disengaged with the Roman Catholic Church. And I saw them filling pews and introducing me to daughter Mariann and saying she hasn't been to church in years, but we told her she'd like this church. And so that's how we're doing it. And it's working.
I'm going to hang on. If you have questions now, hang on. So I'm going to continue on with a couple of other pieces, building upon what's been discussed so far and what Lisa just said, to talk about some of the internal resistance to change. Because one of the things I realized in my leadership, where there were a lot of, and I'm not discounting them at all, there were a lot of external factors that were working against our growth that I could point to. Things that were true about our external reality and the culture and soccer games and how busy people are and the fact we don't have parking and the building wasn't in great shape. I mean, all the things that were true about the things I could list about why we weren't growing. And I decided, because I found this, sometimes it's really helpful to go back into your congregation's history. I found this moment back in the 1970s when the congregation was about to close. And they had a parish meeting. And they were listing, in that parish meeting, they were listing all of the reasons why back in the 1970s there wasn't all the external reasons why people in the early 70s weren't going to church. Do you remember those days? I mean, those were rough days for the Episcopal Church in terms of civil rights and the Vietnam War and secularism. And I mean, just everything was, and this little neighborhood church just got hammered. And oh, by the way, the rector had an affair, and there was just a million things that happened that just conspired to bring this community spiraling down, right? And at this come to Jesus moment, they decided to work on the 2 or 3 things that they could change, as opposed to focus on all the other things that they couldn't. And they put their energies there. And they set out in the course of 2 years, by hook or by crook, to gather up enough money to defy diocesan recommendations and call a new priest. And they did it with they just worked their tails off. And one of the things that they did was they focused internally, not internally in terms of like navel gazing, but what is within our power to change in a world where so many things are outside of our power to change. And I took that as my mantra. First of all, what is in my personal power to change? What is it? And I mentioned that before about my functioning as a rector. And I began to study the example of clergy, not very many from the Episcopal Church because I couldn't find very many in my diocese, but people in other denominations who were leaders of larger congregations, who didn't become large by virtue of endowment or by historical stature, a cathedral, a first church, but who grew a church from small to large in a relatively short period of time. And I just studied them. I just studied them and their churches. And one of the people that I became a mentor to, who became my mentor, said to me, function up. Start functioning as if you were already leading a congregation twice your size, which was fascinating advice for me. And he said, and oh, by the way, you're never going to be able to do that with the people who hired you. Do it with the people who came in who have coming in now. In other words, don't try to change the people and the patterns of relationship that are so established between you. Work on the new relationships. Build your church from the outside in. Allow the old to be, because those people and those ways of being are sacred to them, and you don't want to mess with that. That's their church. But build a new reality alongside it on the edges. And that, to me, was life-giving. First of all, it allowed me to be respectful and loving and in established patterns of relationship with people that I loved and who loved me and who frankly thought of me as their daughter, right? I was 30 when they hired me, and they just, that wasn't going to change. But as newer people began to come into the church, I functioned differently with them to the best of my ability and created different expectations and had another way of providing pastoral care and faith formation for them than I did for the people who were the elders that called me in the first place. And so that was a liberating sense of how to function. I passed around a sheet. I actually, on one of my sabbaticals, I did an official study, and I just left for some of you, and I can make copies or send, if you email me, I can give you more. What I learned about large churches in general that I shared with the congregational leaders when I came back. Non-judgmentally, this had nothing to do with theology. I didn't look at theology. It had nothing to do with denomination, nothing to do with politics. How do large churches function? And what did I learn from them that I thought we could learn from? So just letting your imagination stretch a bit. Now, so that was me, and I had to look at my internal resistance to all of that. Then I began studying the phenomenon of resistance within cultures and congregations.
Can I just insert a piece of theory?
Please, please.
I just want to insert something we didn't talk about before, but I think it fits here.
Yeah.
There's an early contributor to the congregational development literature called Kenan Callahan. And one of the most useful things I learned from him years ago that fits what the bishop is describing is that in any congregation, there are things people are happy about and there are things that people aren't happy about, right? What he learned through his work is that you can only increase satisfaction in a congregation if you attend to the relational dimensions of the congregation. And he contrasts relational dimensions of a congregation with the functional issues of a congregation. The functional are the parking lots, the times of day of the services, how many people, how much money, all of the nuts and bolts of running the life of a congregation are in the functional, important, but functional category. All of the things that she's talking about in terms of building the confidence of people fall into the relational. So what happens is a lot of our churches, especially when we become more anxious, put a lot of energy into the functional because we think we have to. And we don't have the relational stamina to actually sustain that work. And we will not, all that you can do, the more you attend to functional, is you will reduce dissatisfaction. So the griping will go down, okay? If the parking is better, the signage is clearer, the lighting is on, they like the hymns better, they will grumble less. But they will not be more satisfied. We only are more satisfied when the life of the congregation serves and meets us where we are relationally. And that for me was as sort of a light bulb moment, that, as the one that Mariann was describing, that we have to do both. It's not an either or, but we have to pay attention to the relational, which means choosing the right people in leadership to help build those healthy relationships with other people so we have the stamina to attend to the functional. Okay, resistance to change.
That was great. I'll just do a check in here. Any before I jump, because it's coming at this now from a different angle. So before I do, I think we're doing well on time. If there's any questions or comments, a comment or two, question. Is there someone? Okay, great, in the back.
In the model you just alluded to of building, in the model you just alluded to building more on the more recent congregants than the ones who originally called you. Mm-hmm. Are you likely to encounter resistance from that original group? I have a little difficulty imagining it.
Yes, in fact, there is. That's what the resistance to change piece is. Now I want to talk about what happens when you've got competing cultures in the congregation. Okay, the new and the old to be most sort of chronological about it, but it's not necessarily that neat a division. It's more the sense of things moving forward or the sense of change. And the people in your congregation, new or old, young or old, new or recently engaged or there a long time, chronologically younger or older, doesn't really matter. But there are a certain number of people in our congregation who love change. They are the minority. But there are some. There are people who are visionaries, right? People who have a passion for the gospel and who want to share it and are willing to let go of anything that needs to be let go of for the sake of that gospel. Or they just have a really cool idea and they want to run with it, right? They just want to run with it. And they encounter almost immediately from the culture resistance, as do clergy, right? When we come in with our new ideas and our desire to move things forward. And the people say, yeah, that's what we wanted when we called you, but we didn't want it like that, or we didn't. And then you start hearing yourself say, they don't want to change. The very thing that I thought they wanted, they don't want. And there's just this frustration that builds among those who have something that they feel could be so beneficial to the community. Or they're relatively new to the community and they experience something of joy, but there's this tension with others, right? And this, for me, I learned this intuitively before I studied it. And the intuitive learning was with my first capital campaign. And those of you who have been through capital campaigns in a congregation know that you have to start with a vision, right? A vision of what the money, the capital is for, what the investment will produce in terms of a way to glorify the gospel or to live into some glorious thing. So you get this vision, and then you need people to support it. And in the beginning, not very many people do, because it means spending money. And we don't have any money, or we don't have enough money, or the building's fine the way it is. Any number of reasons why doing this thing would be a bad idea. And most ideas in the beginning, to the majority of people, are not good ideas, including us. If we're honest, if we hear a new idea, our instinctual response, unless we're in that 10% of people who just groove on change, our typical response is, it's not going to work. Tried that, nope, it's not going to work. Or, I like things the way they are. So you have this visionary group with this passion. You might be among them. One of the things I learned as a rector is I had to tend to that vision and to those people very, very carefully, because they were entrusted with something precious, something sacred, the new in our midst. Behold, I am making all things new. Here's what we said we wanted. We wanted new people. Well, we have some now, but they're changing us, or they have, it's shifting the equilibrium ways that make me uncomfortable. So I had to tend very carefully to that part in myself so it didn't die, or to the people. But then I also realized there was a huge amount of relationship work that had to happen. And again, going back to the model of the capital campaign, you usually get one or two people who are your lead givers, right? Who are willing to say yes first, and then go out and talk to their friends, right? And at some point, you, as a capital campaign process, are willing to go public with the campaign. Why? Because you already know it's going to succeed. Because you've already received a significant upfront commitment that no matter else what happens, something's going to change. And then suddenly, not suddenly, but in the course of time, something shifts and it becomes the norm of the community to support the campaign as opposed to be against it, right? Sort of basic marketing, it's the tipping point, right? That phenomenon is true no matter what you're talking about in a congregation. And so I learned, and then I studied it. The theory is called diffusion theory. The theory is this tipping point, and it's everywhere now in sociology, but also in church, in missional church literature. Just looking at the United States as a mission field. This is this idea of cultivating your visionaries. This whole piece, for those of you who can see, this represents your community now going this way. Here are your visionaries, 10%. It's not that hard to get 10% of your community excited about something new, including you. But 10% will not move your community. 10% will just tick everybody else off, right? Or be ignored and discouraged, and people will move on, right? They will, because they'll go find a place where their vision is more embraced. Then you have this group of people represented by a very thin, narrow line who are, in the jargon, your key influencers. And these are people who carry authority in the congregation. And when they say yes to something, people listen. Because they don't say yes to everything. And they know the community. The problem with the visionaries is that their connection to the community isn't very deep. And that includes rectors who just come in. It also includes bishops, by the way, who just come in. My connection to you isn't very deep yet. And so I have a lot of relationship work to do with you before you have any right to trust me, right, in going forward. And I am well aware of that. Because in a congregation, you need to be trusted. After about 10 or 15 years, a rector or a key lay or clergy leader can become a key influencer. But you learn to use that influence very carefully. Because if you overdo it, you lose it. Right? And when a key influencer says, okay, this is a good idea, whatever the good idea is, adding an extra service, going with the capital campaign, doing whatever new initiative that might bring about growth. When the key influencers say yes, they bring along with them their best friends, which usually gets the system to about 18%. And the key of this whole idea is you don't have to move the whole community to move something forward. You need to get to that 18%. And when you get to the 18%, change is almost inevitable, and it's out of your hands. Because the early adopters are the people in your community who are willing to go first. They're willing to go first. And when the rest of the next tier in, what's called the early majority, when they see people willing to go first, they're willing to go second. They just needed somebody to jump into the pool first, right? So once you get that 18%, the momentum is moving in your favor. And it's not a slam dunk, but the process is underway and it's moving toward change as opposed to resisting change. Now, here with the early majority, you still only have half the community. So these relationships with these relationships are really critical. The early majority to the late majority. And that's where what Lisa was talking about and what we all know about community, where relationships matter more than content. If I'm in relationship to you and I'm doing something or asking you to do something that you're not crazy about, if our relationship is strong, no matter what you decide, our relationship will carry the day. Right? Our relationship will carry the day and the community will be fine. I can even stay in the community if the community goes in a direction I don't agree with. Right? If our relationships are fragile, then we might lose. We might get the new change, but we may lose half the congregation. If we tend to our relationships, the later majority, who were never crazy about the idea, but went along with it because their friends said they were going along with it, they will eventually come on board. And the hysterical thing is, when you've been at this long enough, is that 3 years down the line, when the new change is the new normal, these people will talk about it as if it was their idea. The new prayer book, you know? You know? I mean, now there's like, we cannot change the new prayer book, right? You know, it's hysterical. But that's the way we're all like that. I'm like that. I'm like that. In the places where, in my life, where I wasn't the champion. Now, there are some people who will never go along. They're called unflatteringly in the sociological jargon laggards. I wish there was a better name for it. But they just will never agree. And they will leave, or they will silently protest in your midst, or they will not so silently protest in your midst. And sometimes it's very, very painful. And sometimes it's just funny, you know. The woman who would always call me and say, when were we going back to the 10 o'clock service on Sunday morning? You know, and we hadn't done it for 7 years. But, you know, I'm like, oh, Virginia, you know what? We're just never going back. Okay, you know, but the issue is we don't, the point, the freeing thing for me was, I don't have to change everybody. And it's okay for people to be in different places. And it's okay if everybody doesn't think it's a good idea. We'll just keep on moving forward. And the other thing that happens is that the idea changes as it becomes part of it's not the same vision. Because as it's owned by the community, it morphs into something that more can own, right? So they own it in a way that would be different if it were just inflicted upon them by, you know, some authoritarian effort. So, hey, I just want to say, if you could raise your hand, if you have experienced something, a process similar to that in your life as a congregation or in other parts of your life. Is this something that you recognize? Okay, all right. That's how I felt when I read it, when I was studying in my demon, as I was reading the official stuff. I thought, oh yeah, I know this stuff. I didn't know that I knew it. And I didn't know that it could be so numerically documented, that the goal was 18%, right? And I actually remember, we had a capital campaign, the second capital campaign, that turned really ugly at St. John's, really, really ugly. And it turned ugly, I think, as I look back on it, for two reasons. Number one, we were not clear about the vision. The people who had the vision were clear, but we were not clear in communicating it, number two. And number two, the people who were carrying it didn't tend to their relationships early on. So even though it was actually a really good idea, and now everybody loves it, but at the time, people were really struggling with it. And these relationships were not firmly in place. And the key influencers were quieter than normal, including the rector. I was quieter than normal because I couldn't figure out what was happening in the congregation. And the last thing I wanted was to sort of have my definition of success rise or fall on a successful capital campaign, right? I just couldn't go there. So I was trying to figure out what was at work, and I just couldn't. It took me months to figure out first to find my voice and to figure out what I thought was happening. What happened was some of these people started to organize, and organize against this. couple of these people were really mad. And one of them was very mad at me because I was being too wishy-washy in my, was I for it or against it? And he was waiting for me to say something. And I was trying to figure out what I thought was at stake. And one day, and I was walking with my husband, and these people are already taking pledges, right? So they're way ahead of everybody else. And my husband and I are walking and walking, and I said, so are we going to contribute to this thing? I mean, this is the level of the conversation, right? And I said, yeah, we are, but I'm trying to figure out. He said, do you think this is going to work? And I said, I think it is, but we haven't figured out what the issue is yet. And gradually, it occurred to some of us that what the issue was the shift from being a small neighborhood congregation to being a destination church where people were coming from all over different parts of the metro area. And that we were doing some things to our building that were saying in a definitive way that we were committed to that larger ministry. And that we were unapologetic in investing in the kinds of things that would make us an attractive church for a wider body. And there were some generational issues, too, of leadership. And when I got up in the pulpit to proclaim the vision that day, one of these people stopped speaking to me and refused to speak to me. We tried, and still, we are unreconciled to this day. It's heartbreaking to me. He stayed in the community, and I bet is like lobbying the search committee like crazy, for my successor. But this was painful. Now, once it all worked out, everybody thinks it's a great idea. And one of the key moments was when this person started attacking personally these people to these people. And these people got irritated at him and started supporting them. So he unwittingly contributed to, these people were passive, completely passive. And then and it was, were you there? It was just, and I was watching all of this thinking, oh my gosh. And at one meeting, when we didn't have enough money to do some key thing, 4 people stood up and said, look, this is why I am putting my check on the line, and including a single mom who didn't have enough money, somebody who was we were raising, they were just saying, this is why I'm doing it, this is important. And we were like right around here. And I remember thinking, okay, we're off and running. It's going to happen. That's just one example, probably the most dramatic of my time there. And when we talk about it now, people on every end of the spectrum talk about it as a conversion experience because it was so profound to them, as sort of community moving through change and a collision of understandings of what it means to be church. But with the exception of a few, we all came through it.
I just have one quick thought to add to that, which is, I think in the church, this is a great model, and it's a model that does come from the human development world. I think one of the things we can lend as sort of value added is that what's the difference for us between a good idea and a vision is the process of discernment. And the situations that I know where this process has unfolded very healthily and truly has been part of not only fulfilling that particular vision, but has truly been part of the formation of the men and women and young people in that congregation, is a process where the great idea was this nascent possibility that someone or some group of people offered, and then others were willing to gather around it in prayer, in some kind of structured process for discernment. It doesn't have to be a delay. It doesn't have to be, it's a great idea, but we'll do it in 3 years. But to say that is such a good idea, it deserves our prayerful attention. And figuring out what the culture of discernment would be in your congregation strengthens the capacity for visionaries to then tell their story in language that makes sense to people who might otherwise end up here because it doesn't sound like church. If their story is talking about buildings and rooms for after-school programs for English as a second language that has nothing to do with our membership and nothing to do with coffee hour, that doesn't feel familiar. But if it starts to talk about what it means to actually witness, to respond to the needs of the poor as a person of faith, and we begin to hear that as a possibility that is rooted in our baptism, then people who want it to feel the way it's always felt can imagine themselves closer to that vision. So I think one of the things we want to be thinking about as leaders in the church is how do we discern between all these good ideas where God is really calling us to respond as a community. And that does take some time. It doesn't have to take forever, and it's not a stall tactic, but it's a critical moment, I think, for us as Christians.
It also tends to the relationships in a really critical way, so that people who may not have been a part of this really fun, exciting, energizing birthing can own something and shape it in a way that is authentic to them and their sense of who God is in their lives. So it also strengthens the fabric of the congregation.
Another tiny learned piece of wisdom from my life in the parishes is that one of the hints that sometimes is lightly camouflaged resistance is when people say, they get nervous about the language of change. They say, we don't like change. Well, we're Christians. We like transformation. And so they sort of try to say, well, we'll talk about transformation. And if you listen, for some of us, that's just really good language. But then there's others, if you listen carefully, they're just below the surface is, I'm not going anywhere, whether it's with God, without God, I ain't going. So don't call it change, but maybe you can get further with transformation. Be careful. Okay, there were questions.
A couple of questions. We'll start over here on this corner, Bill and Joey, and then we'll go around there.
In my work in the theater before I became a priest, I saw this process happen many, many times in community theater companies. One of the things that I saw happen over and over again is you can get to that place where, in retrospect, everybody is on board that it was a good idea, but if the relationships weren't tended to, the relationships that get broken in the process can stay broken even when everybody comes around to the idea.
I amen to that. Thank you for that. Joey, we'll get Joey over here and then we'll go.
I just want to ask, in a lot of the congregations that I work with, the question comes up, do the visionaries need to be the vestry? And I wonder if you guys can respond to that.
Good question. I don't think so. I don't even think the visionary needs to be the rector. I often found I would hear the vision in the community. I would hear it. And I would say, it's like, oh my gosh, there it is. And in the beginning, I used to feel really anxious about that, like, well, why didn't that occur to me? But later it was, no, my job was to tend to the vision and to nurture it and to cultivate it and to recognize it when it's spoken. And I think similarly, visionaries can be on the vestry, but often the vision will come from the people. Would that be your experience, Joey, from your...
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that there's this, I mean, if we've got a parish of 120 people and you've got 10 on the vestry, we fall into this thinking that then our visionaries and our early adapters need to be the vestry. And
Right.
I think that frequently is not the case.
My
Right.
piece about discernment is that whoever has, because God works in mysterious and wonderful ways, those ideas that become the germ of a good vision, need then to be in relationship with the core disciples of the congregation. Right. So if it's someone who has this idea from their first visit, and it's just this great idea, it's not going to happen from the outside in. Once the idea has been spawned, then it really needs to be nurtured and led into fruition by people who are core disciples. Not necessarily the vestry, not necessarily all of the vestry, but men and women and young people who are capable of translating the vision into things that are deeply rooted in their faith.
Thanks for that. Questions over here? Yes?
Yes, Bill Dickinson. I'm from St. Mark's Church, Capitol Hill. If you could give a word, I think following on those remarks, in regard to transparency and credibility. Oftentimes when you get a process started, a group is set up to do the leading, and then there's always suspicions as to what's really going on, and stories start going on, and that can break down the whole process.
It sure can. I don't quite know what to say except transparency and accountability, right, are absolutely key, and integrity of process. And so that people need to know where things are and where you are. And perhaps that in that example I gave you, the people they were right to be frustrated with me because they wanted clarity from me that I couldn't give them because I wasn't yet clear, and that was frustrating to them. But if I had tried to be clear when I wasn't, or if we try to hide things from people in the community, that very rarely do good things come from that. Unless, and in certain search processes, for example, when confidentiality is important for the sake of people's lives. There are some boundaries around that. But in general, to be transparent with your community is really key, and particularly when anxiety rises about, quote unquote, something happening that people don't know about. Because it doesn't even matter what the something is, the fact that there is something creates a dynamic that is really difficult to overcome. But often I think what happens with, I don't know, just the way we had an idea, just before I was leaving St. John's, we had this idea that it was really time for us to invest in staffing to lead our justice work and our mission work outside the congregation that had always been done by volunteers, but it was the one area of our church's life that didn't really have, apart from what I could give to it, real oversight in a staffing way. And of course we didn't have money for this, right? I mean, but it was an idea that would not go away. And every time we did strategic evaluations or conversations with people, it would always come up again. And one year, about 3 years ago, I guess, the vestry said, okay, it's time. We just have to take a look at this. And we're going to start a process where we're going to look at what it might mean to add some staffing dollars to this position. All of the people who were once the sort of visionaries of the church, who are really active in social justice ministries, got wind of it as something that the vestry was cooking up that they didn't have anything to do with. And they were mad. And they thought it was a bad idea. And they were, you wouldn't believe the people who just were. And I was trying, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to try to be not anxious, and I'm going to I'm going to work on my relationships, and we're going to, there's all those things you say to yourself when people that you really love and respect are coming at you and saying that is the stupidest idea I have ever heard. And so what we did and the vestry at this point is a very young vestry. St. John's vestry at this point had turned over, so many of the leaders had been there less than 10 years. Right? Not all, but many. And so what we did is we had a big powwow with all of the leaders of all the different justice and social outreach ministries of the church. And the vestry and they were pretty nervous, let me tell you, they just laid out the chronology, the event, what they were thinking, how they thought they might go about doing the stopgap funding. But to Lisa's point, it's obviously we were going to talk to you, honest. What do you think? Mm-hmm. And by the time the meeting was over, more than half of that group was not only supportive of it, they offered to help fund it, and they talked about it with their peers in such a way that it happened. So it's almost like we moved this process into here quicker because these people tended to their relationships, and we caught it early enough that it didn't fester. And so it was, but that's a community that's gotten practice at this. I mean, that's what happens, I think, when you begin to establish a culture where over time the leadership is more adept at the processes, so they can catch things before they go really sour. Because as you said, it's really painful when it gets to that point. Yes, ma'am. I don't know your name, but if you, and then I'm sorry, and then Greg, you're afterwards. But this woman here. No, give it to her. Sorry.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Rita Scott from Calvary. On 6th Street Northeast.
Yes.
And just throw sort of a wrench in here. Calvary is an aging church.
Yes.
And I think that we have had visionaries, we have visionaries now, and they're visionaries that have become, that are trusted because they perhaps have grown up within the church, or their parents were well respected. So they had the trust of the church. The problem, though, I think, is that these visionaries don't have, others who can help them right. to bring about the change. And what happens is they become burnt out,
yep.
trying to do everything.
Yep.
Not because they don't have the congregational support, but because they can't do everything that's necessary in the church. So right. I want to know, where that falls in.
I really hear that, and thank you for saying it. It's something that I think about a lot now. From my vantage point coming into this diocese, what can we do collectively to build support around communities, within communities, so that those ideas, I mean, you've just got a lot of really hardworking but exhausted people, or who have been carrying a lot, on their shoulders, and this, the possibilities are there, but how do we infuse new life, new energy, new resources, greater capacity, so that those visions can take root? And so I see that as a larger issue for us as a church, not just focused on one congregation like Calvary, you just go figure that out by yourself, but we're in this together. And we could look at some of those systemic realities together and together discern a path that would allow all of our congregations to thrive over time. And so you have my commitment to that. I feel like that's part of our next steps as a community of faith, as the diocese, is to identify as ways that we can begin to move collectively in support of one another in congregations. Thank you for that. Greg.
Thanks, Bishop. One of the things I'm thinking about is the collaborative work we're doing in Southern Maryland, and because you're helping us lead it, and so a lot of us in Southern Maryland have we love our churches. I mean, we have clergy and lay folks who love our Sunday morning churches, but our churches primarily are very small, small in numbers, and frankly very small in space. So I think we have this group of kind of visionaries and early adapters who have gotten on board with the idea that even though, we love our Sunday morning congregations, and we think we can do so much more by doing more with others. But I'm wondering about the Clevenger-Warren circles there, because I don't know. I mean, theoretically, I can imagine that people could go to a place on Sunday mornings and see their friends and have connection, that search for community, but also be leaders and be disciples in ways that involve inter-parish relationships. But, I mean, that's a theory. But in practice, I could also see that there could be some real conflicts between your congregation and the work you do with other congregations. Right. And so I wonder if you can just think out loud for a little bit about the tipping point with that relationship.
Yeah, I used to think about that a lot in the city of Minneapolis, because we had, 7 or 8 congregations in the city, and all of them in the neighborhoods very small, things that we couldn't do. We couldn't, very few of us could launch a successful youth program, for example. We just didn't have the critical numbers. We tried it in a couple of different places, but never quite pulled off the idea of saying, we are the Episcopal Church in Minneapolis. And we are going to think of ourselves as the church with 8 campuses or 8 outposts, whatever your 8 resting stations, whatever the word is, and then begin to think about our gifts and our resources in a more fluid way. As I think about the Episcopal Church across the country, it seems to me that something like that may be in the wind. We have an abundance of small congregations, both numerically and in size. They are worthy. They're not, we shouldn't throw them away. They're part of our resource. How can we utilize those resources, those people and those treasures and that history in a way that serves the new? And something like that, as what you all are imagining, ought to be possible. But as Lisa was saying earlier, it will involve a lot of trust, because there'll be some big things that will feel like letting go. And I think, as my mentor used to say, before you ask people to let go of something, give them something to hold on to. Give them something to step onto before you ask them to let go of something precious. And that may be part of our challenge as the church.
We were in Minnesota together, and I took Tai Chi for the first time. And one of the first Tai Chi postures I was taught was how to walk on ice. And it has to do with transferring your weight so that you never are on one foot precariously balanced. It's that same sense that you need to be having something to hold on to. Greg, I know you're involved, for example, in the new camping initiative here in the diocese. I just came from a national church meeting of Episcopal camps and conference directors, program leaders, and so forth. I say that because this vision of what we are as a whole, this kind of macro vision of church, is very real right now across the Episcopal Church. There are networks and resources, our camp and conference centers, our schools, our chaplaincies, our congregations, our cathedrals, our missions to particular populations that may not have buildings. that are beginning, I think, as a gift of a struggling economic time to think about who we are as one body. And I'm absolutely convinced that there are some extraordinary possibilities for ministry emerging that we can't yet imagine, and a few very visionary people are naming, that will include honoring things like our smaller physical congregations, because so many of them are in locations where nothing else is standing. They're in urban centers where we need to be present. They have the building, they may not have the people, but other resources, our schools, our summer camp staff that aren't working at that time of year, but love the church and love working hard, are available. There are all of these ways that we're beginning to talk to each other. And I think we need to keep that going. This diocese is clearly committed to that level of conversation. But we know it baptismally, we know it in terms of our polity, our structure, and yet we have not, I would say typically in the last 50 years, practiced that level of being one body. There has been much more of a sense of a free market system that we have to each be an independent vendor of what it is we do. So I would just want to commit to you that there are a lot of folks in a lot of different, perhaps unlikely places, affirming the work you are doing locally in your congregation and saying they need you as much as you may need them.
And I'd like to say, Ken, I see you, I'm going to let you join in just a second, but I'd like to say that from talking to you now at the beginning of this episcopate with you, that this kind of collaborative work of figuring out, discerning ways together that we might draw each other and those we represent into this kind of conversation is, for me, the promised land. And so I would love, and it's actually in the plans for the next few years to begin discussing with you, not just deciding what those groupings are, but discerning what are the right groupings of people to be talking about these issues. Who would be helpful people for you and your congregations to be in conversation with, both for added resources and for collaborative learning. And we're going to start that tomorrow in the small group, just as a test case, really, but then also move toward in these next years in that kind of discerning way. So I'm hoping that your interest here today is an expression of ongoing relationship as we go forward. Just one second, I'm going to have Ken speak first, and then I'll get to you.
I'll be really brief. Ken Howard from St. Nicholas, Darnestown. I just want to say I really appreciate what you're talking about in terms of being careful about the language and talking in terms of transformation instead of change and giving people something to hold on to, because I think the change speaks about leaving something totally behind and moving on to something else, and transformation speaks to moving on to something new that still holds on to the heart of what we're here for.
Right.
And so I think it really speaks to us as, for a need for just constant teaching.
Yes.
To people about what we're here for is not to hold on to something that was or to repair something that was, but to constantly be asking ourselves what is the heart of what we do, and that we need to always be risking, taking risks to achieve what God is calling us to be.
Thank
and
you.
that will always include something of the heart of what we've had all along.
That's well said. Thank you, Ken. Yes.
I'm John Johnson from St. Thomas Parish, and I have one quick question and one expanded one. First is, how will this program being recorded be shared? Because I think I'd like to share it with my own congregation in some way. And the second is, could you speak a little bit more about your experience of becoming a destination parish?
How will this program be expanded? I'm not quite sure we're at the program level yet, but this... Oh, there's a tape. Okay, yeah, there'll be a tape. And starring all of us. And this will be, these are some of the core themes and ideas that I bring, right, that many of you already know, both either intuitively or consciously. And we're on the journey now. And so if you would like to bring some of this into the congregation, call me and we'll start. One of the things I'm really interested in knowing is who's ready now to start talking about these things collectively, and who are the people who have a sense of leadership in this, and how can we begin to put some things into our communal practice. The second one was say more about how we became a destination church. Part of it is just the nature of our society now. We were built as a neighborhood parish at a time when most people either walked or took the trolley to church. People don't walk or take trolleys anymore to most of their destinations. And if they're willing to drive 20 miles to find their favorite grocery store or to take their kids to the school that they wanted, more people were willing to drive to St. John's. And because we stood for some things, both in terms of our public witness, our commitment to kids, our commitment to music and innovative liturgy, that people were willing to drive for. And so we wound up being about a 50-50 split, neighborhood, destination. Now I'm going to close with one final thing, which is circling all the way back around to what Lisa said at the beginning, which is, if we don't tend to our spiritual lives, and if we don't tend to our discipleship as followers of Jesus, individually and in our congregations, we will be basically, pick your metaphor, driving a car with not enough gas in it, in a boat with not wind in our sails, spending money in a bank account that's running low. We need that connection ourselves. All the studies say that the first people to lose their core spiritual practices in the Christian community are the clergy. It's an epidemic, friends, and it's the first thing that we have to turn around, which doesn't mean that we're going to go back to our seminary practices of morning and evening prayer and communion at noon, unless you're lucky enough to be at Christ Church Georgetown, right? We're not going to have, you have to find your own spiritual practice that works for you. We have to teach spirituality in our congregations in a way that is much deeper than we're doing now. Cultivating a biblical imagination in our communities, helping our leaders to think imaginatively and biblically and open to the Spirit. We are not adept at this, and we have a lot of work to do within. Then we will be more confident in our we will have more to share, and we will be, in fact, more confident to share what we have when we actually are more confident of what indeed we have as people called to walk this way. Amen? Amen. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.